Hi, we're Auction Conservation, and this is the Shoe Room Sessions. Kaisie, welcome to the Shoe Room Sessions on tour.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Cool. Can you tell people who you are and what you do?
Okay, my name is Kaisie Rayner, and I currently help financial institutions understand the very kind of complex sustainability landscape and what the next best step for them is in helping bring sustainable finance and sustainability objectives into their core business operating model.
Wow, do we need that?
Yeah.
Take me back to the start and tell me how you got here. Where did you grow up? What was life like to this point?
So my career makes more sense in retrospect.
Oh, no one's ever done it this way.
And doesn't make much sense if you go kind of start to end. And I think that's true of lots of people in their careers, right? You end up somewhere and you look back and you're like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. So helping financial institutions now was kind of born out of working within financial institutions and helping to write what became a framework that sat under the GFANZ commitment at COP26. And that itself was really born out of a question of people who worked in finance saying, what do we need to do as investors to help achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and realign capital to achieve that objective? And I got there because I worked in finance for 10 years doing all the jobs within a financial services organization that helps you understand how money flows. From working in a risk audit function to working in a proposition area to working in an operations area. And I kind of started there because I was at university and unlike others, I was the first in my family to go to university and I needed to pay my way. And this was in Australia. And so I realized money was going to be quite important to that. And so that was my driving force, was understanding how money works and how do I get some of it in order to live my life. So when I was at university, I studied finance and weirdly organizational change. And at the time, people were like, why on earth would you want to understand technical finance, like the efficient market frontier, and organizational change and behavior? And now, looking into how that has transformed in my career, it's all been about helping people change the financial system to achieve the goals for society. So it makes sense. But at the time, it didn't make sense. And there's been a few pit stops along the way in my career, including working as a financial controller of a ski resort for a number of years, taking time out to have kids. But it's always kind of been in the financial system. And as I've kind of grown more aware of the purpose of finance, that's kind of led me to where I am now, trying to mobilize finance as a force for good to help create a future that we all want to live in. And that's ultimately what I'm doing now. So I run my own consultancy and research business called A Future Worth Living In. Because fundamentally, I want to be able to say to my kids that I did everything that I could to help create a future worth living in for them within the context of kind of the financial sector.
What an amazing opening. What is the purpose of finance for you?
I'm not going to take a drink there for that one. Okay, so the purpose of finance, I did some reading beforehand and I read some of the financial theory books, and they talk about stocks and flows and all of this kind of stuff. And there's a great kind of intellectual pursuit in understanding finance, but I don't think that's what the purpose of finance is for me anyway. I kind of see finance and money as energy. It's a store of energy, and it helps us move some of our energy. So we work today and we move that energy through time so we can benefit from the energy expended in our youth, in our retirement. It's a store of value, but fundamentally it's a creative force that helps create the world around us. And it can be a destructive force as well. And when we start to see it like that, we recognize that where we deploy capital builds or destroys the world that we will live in the future. So it can be lots of different things depending on the perspective that you come from financial theory or social justice. But fundamentally, I think of it as like a creative force.
How unique a perspective do you think that is compared to the institutions and the investors you speak to regularly?
I think when I say it to people, they clock it and go, oh yeah, that's true. And you can see it in, I use this picture of Dubai 30 years ago and Dubai now, and you see what money, so the application of energy, whether it's human energy or financial energy, has created this city. And people go, oh yeah, I see that. but they don't clock it as that. They see it, yes, the store of value or a way to generate wealth or numbers in a spreadsheet to be optimized. But I think what I say is something that is like a core kernel of truth that people then don't disagree with. And it just opens up a kind of new perspective of thinking about money and its purpose. And fundamentally, money's meant to be there to serve society and help us create what kind of world we want to live in.
So I love the journey backwards in your career. If we reflect back on the sort of awareness of purpose to the finance sector, when did you start hearing that? When did you start recognizing that people were more talking about finance having a positive impact and a positive purpose? And how has that changed since then to now?
So I think the kind of purposeful piece, maybe I lose track with the COVID years, which years
Yeah, it's
when,
like,
right?
time distorted for that period.
It did.
Right? Yeah.
So for me, the purpose element came into being when I had children. And I also watched a movie called The Age of Stupid, which is a brilliant movie. We'll add it to the notes or something. The Age of Stupid, when I had a very small child, and it's about how stupid we were in not tackling climate change. And that for me was when I understood that finance had a bigger purpose. And when I first came back to the UK from living in Australia, I think I was just like speaking to nobody when I was trying to talk to people about finance having a purpose. Maybe like one person, but they thought I was a bit strange. And then like slowly I started to talk to more people. And I think one of the things that made a difference was connecting people and money. And organizations started to engage with their customers. Pension companies started to engage with their customers, just the whole kind of customer persona, went out and did customer research. And most pension customers don't know where their money is invested. Lots of them think it's in a bank somewhere, just being safe. And so when they started talking to customers, they realized that their customers thought that money was meant to have a purpose. And it was like something had got lost in translation. Normal people think that money is doing something or just being safe. They didn't realize it was doing all the things it was actually doing. And so the actuarial profession and the normal people on the street had this disconnect. And I think when we started to address that kind of disconnect between professional money managers and people on the street, that's when people started to realize, oh, hang on, we need to start incorporating some of these beliefs into what we do with money. And then I think you start to see it in the rise of consumers, where they prefer brands that have a better purpose. So I think it started to rise, and then, I don't know, something kind of clicked. And then all of a sudden, and I used to say this when I was in a room full of people, we were up at the Mound, which is a big building in Scotland. You can see it in the skyline looking at the Royal Mile, and it's the building for the Bank of Scotland. So it's got this big green kind of roof, and then there's this massive room, and I don't know how many it holds, a lot of people. And I did something on a stage there talking about the purpose of money, and I said, oh, this is very unusual. I used to talk to like one person in a locked room, and now there's all of you wanting to understand what it is we can do with money and how we can use it to make the world a better place. So I think it started slowly, and then once the tap started to turn on, there was a wave of people wanting to understand. And I think some of it is genuine, and I think some of it is just, well, people want us to do this, so we have to.
When you were talking about that changing customer perception, the case study I always grab for is Patagonia. And the advertising campaign on their Black Friday, don't buy this jacket type thing, so jarring in that way. What are some of the examples we might be able to point to in the financial world of people bringing that to life a little?
So I think you've got the Make My Money Matter campaign, which has been great at that. There were also some campaigns in other countries where they talked about, I think they're talking about having like a vegan pension or vegan electricity, and they had like meat coming out of an electricity plug. So there's been some really interesting precedents elsewhere. I think we haven't had our Patagonia moment really in the financial sector. I think you've had some very small companies doing things, some very large companies but not born in the UK like Triodos, but they're still very much seen as not the mainstream. And I think that's where we suffer from a branding problem, right? It's a branding problem. So sustainable finance or responsible investment is always trying to say how good it is. Like we should be doing this because it's good. Sustainable finance, it has all these flavors, whether it's impact investing or ESG or RI or CSR, and then we lose everybody. But actually, it's like a category error. Why are we so busy fighting for promoting sustainable finance? What's all the other finance? Like, the opposite of sustainable is unsustainable.
We're holding unfair standards to it completely.
Absolutely.
So I had a conversation about, we'll come on to this, I'm sure, but voluntary carbon markets and everything that a high integrity carbon credit needed to have. If you applied these standards to any other market, so because the carbon market's so nascent, I often equate it to buying a car. So you can buy a Vauxhall, which is largely terrible than when I was younger, or you can buy a Tesla, which is a wonderful car. That is a range of options that are there. You can buy a terrible carbon credit, or you can buy a great carbon credit. No one's going to their Tesla. I also want you to be my house, my school, my hospital, and be able to fly, but you're a car. Whereas with a carbon credit or with any form of sustainable offering, we also want it to do all these other amazing and fix every ill in society, as opposed to just being the thing it's good at.
Yeah, and there's so much kind of critique in this side, and it deflects and leaves alone this whole other space. It was one of my kids that I was trying to explain what I was doing, and they were like, oh, so it was like the other stuff is like junk food. So you've got like healthy food and junk food. But we put all the health warnings on the junk food, and we put all the health warnings on cigarettes and bleach and things like that. But within finance, what we're starting to do is put all the labels on sustainable finance and just leave all the other stuff alone.
Yeah.
Instead of putting health warnings on pensions that are invested in bad companies and putting like, your pension has killed 10,000 people this year. We're not doing that. We're like, oh, it's really green over here.
That's a brilliant analogy. So on the food one, it's the equivalent of saying, no, that piece of fruit is terrible because it doesn't taste like ice cream.
Yeah.
You need to taste like ice cream as well as being really good for me. I mean, someone does need to do that. I'm quite partial to ice cream, but avocado ice cream is pretty good. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's flipped the other way. And what's your reason why we're there? Why do you think that's the situation?
Because nobody wants to come out and say that they manage 100 billion of unsustainable finance. It's like, nobody wants to say that. They're kind of okay saying, oh, 10% of our money is sustainable, but they don't want to say 90% of it is unsustainable. They don't want to talk about the fact that, yeah, because it lives within this big system that is incentivizing all of these activities. And yeah, they don't want to say that.
It's the exact same thing in the environment sector. So there's so many truths that you're not allowed to out or talk about. So one of my favorites is we're absolutely told nature's fucked, the environment's in a terrible, terrible position. That is a truth that we're all supposed to accept. We're equally told that local people understand the landscape best, and they're absolutely who should tell us what to do with this landscape. And it's the local people who own it at the moment, and it's fucked. How do we square that circle? And you're just not allowed to out it. It's not okay. I'm hearing the same thing from the finance sector, that everyone knows it's doing all the negative things. It's just the people are too incentivized and too tied into it, either financially or emotionally or morally, that no one wants to out it.
I think there is that. I think there's also this element of being trapped within a system that we created and forgetting that we were the architects of the system, not just the players within the system. Yeah. And also just an abject failure of imagination. So I think in the financial system or the economic system or the political system.
I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking politics. So I worked in the public sector for 9 years. And people ask me, and I'm like, it's not going to make any difference really, because the civil service is meant to not let anything change. The whole system is meant to stop things changing. And people forget we made the system.
Yeah, they forget we made the system, and that if we want the system to be any different, we need to remake the system. And so we have a lot of people at the moment recognizing the need for a new system, but we haven't yet allowed this new system to be imagined and spoken and be wrong and be right in ways and wrong in ways and test and learn. Like, lots of people want a new system to emerge, but they want it to be 100% perfect. And it's not going to emerge like that. So I think firstly, the space to call out that the system isn't working. And then secondly, this space to be creative and playful and imagine what a new system might look like, and to, say the emperor is naked. And start to say out loud some of these truths that need to be spoken in order for them to be questioned and in order for them to be reimagined.
I love the way you went to fail first rather than succeed first. Why are you okay with that concept? Why do you think it's okay to fail on your way to a better answer?
I think you have to. Because you're trying. I think when it's a big system change, there is no one magic silver bullet. And I think it will take lots of different people doing lots of different things all at once. And our system didn't come about fully formed. It has emerged over time. And so I think you have to give yourself permission to imagine something radical and then move from radical to possible, rather than start with what is possible, because you're not really going to get very far. So that kind of space to fail is really important. And there's loads of quotes, which I'm not going to remember, around, you just have to keep failing until you succeed. I don't think anyone's ever done anything and succeeded the first time.
No. So I'm not from the financial world at all. So big data and environmental background. So it's a really interesting lens in for me. And the last sort of 18 months or so, we built our portfolio of assets and started managing land for conservation and for positive impact. And then the finance sector came to us and said, we're really interested, want to get involved. Most people just tried to buy us and we said, no, thank you, we're not for sale. But had some really interesting conversations. And over that last 18 months, I've learned tons. What I've been told as one of the barriers is that literally the trustees and the decision makers sat on those pension boards are literally not allowed to fail, and that it's structured. A, is that true? And B, if it is, how do we help improve that situation?
Okay, so start with the easy answer and then unpick it. No, that's not true. They fail all the time. But they fail in allowed ways, right? Yeah. So what they're scared of is doing something that nobody else is doing and failing in a different way than everyone else.
Yeah, there's no blame on failing in a normal way.
There's no blame. So when everybody lost money in the financial crash, it's like, oh yeah, we lost money, but so did everybody else, so it's fine. It's probably not fine as a pensioner. You're like, no, I don't want you to, it doesn't matter if everybody lost money, I'm sad that I lost money. So part of it is this not wanting to step outside the herd. And part of it is there are all these kind of rules within the system about what you're allowed to do and the decisions that you're allowed to make. And so if you're on the outside looking in, all you can see is kind of the end state. And part of what I enjoy doing is like acupuncture for a system. Or like if you're a plumber and there's a leak in a massive big building, but you design the building and you put in all the plumbing, then you can like walk to the 5th floor and like put your finger on a pipe and then it's fixed. But if you're the plumber that didn't have anything to do with the building, then you just stand outside and people are getting wet. So I like being the person that goes in and figures out, okay, hang on, if we just like turn this tap here, then maybe we can stop it leaking or redirect the flow. So for lots of pension trustees, some of the things that constrain them are they use existing asset classes and assumptions about future growth to inform their decision making. The assumptions on future growth are all predicated on the last 50 years and the fact that the future will look like the last 50 years. But we know that that's not true. And if it does look like the last 50 years, then we're in trouble. So that's one of those truths that you can call out and go, okay, so your current assumptions are false. We need to think about what might be true. And then the other one, which seems like it's such an inconsequential thing, but it has huge implications, is there's this list of things called permissible assets. And if you're optimizing for a portfolio, for a pension scheme, you have this list of permissible assets: listed equity, corporate fixed income, bonds, government debt, maybe some property. Probably a forest is not on there. Renewable energy, wind farms, solar panels, that kind of stuff wasn't on there. So you're like, well, if it's not on my list, I can't invest in it. It's like, well, you need to change the list. And like, not my job. My job is to optimize assets across the list, not to question the list. So change the list.
Who owns the list? Who has the ability to do that?
So it's like this community of investment people that own the list. But if nobody sticks their hand up and goes, okay, we need a new list, then it doesn't change. So some people stuck their hand up and went, we need a new list. We need a new asset class that allows us to invest in illiquid things over the long term. And those people help drive through the development of a new asset, a long-term asset fund, which pension schemes can now use, and some asset managers have launched and some schemes are using. And they made some assumptions about future growth and correlation. And the people who run the models went, oh, okay, we'll put that in our model. And now you're starting to see people allocate towards that asset class. So I think in the system, it takes two kinds of people: the people who are doing the day-to-day and running the system, and the kind of tweakers of the system and going in and slightly changing things so that you can start to redirect. I mean, it's a lot of money in UK pensions, it's trillions. Even a small portion of that into a new asset class that is about long-term value, that's about nature recovery, that's about true sustainable infrastructure, is going to make a huge difference.
The two type of people you mentioned, it reminds me of the story I was told about the sort of Kaizen system thinking, so continuous improvement type work. So all the really automated factories in Japan that produce Toyota and Hyundai and those vehicles, the people that worked in the system weren't also allowed to work on the system. Someone independent would come in, look across everything and do those tweaks and that acupuncture, whereas the people in the system would work on the performance of it in its current state.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting.
Definitely. But I think there is that element for you to tweak a system, you have to know it intimately. So that you understand that if you tweak that bit over here, that the consequence of doing that is going to be felt through the system.
So when we, at the time of recording, we've bought 11 estates across the country. And we try to adjust as little as possible in the first 12 months of ownership, because you don't know what pulling this lever does in another part of the system. The only things we do tend to stop are things that we know are fundamentally bad that are going on. If someone's behaviour towards wildlife's inappropriate, we will stop that. If the way they're looking after livestock isn't okay, we would stop that. But in terms of practices, we want to observe as much as possible in each of the seasons, get as much neighbouring advice and understanding so that you've got a series of opinions and perspectives, and then we start to make changes. And that's quite hard, because you arrive to a place and immediately on day one, you start talking to the people and they're like, well, I turned up for a presentation on what you're going to change. And we're like, we don't know yet. We're just watching. Half the people are really annoyed that we haven't got a fully thought out plan. The other half are like, okay, go even slower. So you can't quite get the pace right in terms of what people want. It's interesting. So you've mentioned some barriers so far that we need to improve things. So education, awareness of people where their money is, the nature of things that people can do when they look to allocate. What else do we need to fix? Where else are some of the barriers that you'd like to see change?
Okay, so the big one is incentives. And it comes back to that kind of labeling piece and not naming things that we don't want to do. So at the moment, we've set up the system with a series of incentives that directs capital in its various different asset classes. But if we want to change where that goes, these incentives need to change. And so there's some really big incentives. One of the big ones about not being allowed to do that is within corporate structures, we've set up legal incentives for the way that directors behave, whether or not they're allowed to take into account the environment when they're making decisions on the basis of their company. So at the moment, Section 172 in corporations law says that you can have regard to the environment, but you're supposed to prioritize shareholder return. And so all these incentives kind of sit within the system, layered within the system. And so looking at those incentives, and do they still serve the system as we reach capacity within our ecological kind of boundaries? Do they still serve us, or do they need to change? I think that's one of the biggest and unseen barriers with trying to change the system. You see it with stewardship and engagement. So in the finance sector, we talk about stewardship and engagement and engaging with companies to make them do better things for the environment. But if a director has a legal responsibility to prioritize the financial returns of the company, it doesn't matter how many times we meet with them and have a cup of tea and ask them to be good. If that legal structure and that incentive is set in a certain direction, they can't legally do it.
Does the B Corp movement help with any of that?
B Corps, mutuals, co-ops, yes, anything that has a different corporate structure.
Can you help explain those to people who might not know?
Okay, so a B corporation, I'm going to get this wrong, but let's see how we go. A B corporation has at its heart a purpose beyond profit. A co-op is a different type of legal structure that brings people together, and a mutual was a really prevalent structure for financial institutions in Scotland, but sadly has been under pressure, and we only have one mutual left for pension funds, and that's Royal London. So the mutuals historically in Scotland are beautiful and very close to my heart. Scottish Widows, for example, was a mutual, and it was set up, was it the Boer War? It was set up for a war, basically. Lots of men were going off to war, and they were worried about their families and what would happen if they died at war. So all these men put money in a pot, and whoever didn't come back, their widows would be paid out of this pot. I think that's fundamentally, this transfer of energy and money serving a social purpose. That was the beginning of this kind of pensions and benefits. And that's what a mutual society could do. It was there for the mutual benefit of the members of the society. And these financial institutions stayed as mutuals right through to, I think it was about 2001. And then they all started to demutualize and became limited companies. And there's only a few left that operate as mutuals. So you can see it with Nationwide as well, another financial institution. And the core difference is that profit maximization ethos is not there. So a corporation will make profits at any cost, and mutuals and co-ops, etc., will make reasonable profits. And most of them have a cap on their profit margin or their profits, so that they don't seek to extract wealth from the society in which they operate.
Why did we lose mutuals? Why did they drop away?
So there was this perception that they were, I suppose the civil service and public service suffer from this as well, that they weren't as efficient as they could be. There was also the ability to release profits, pay out a big hefty dividend to lots of members. And so they went through a vote, went out to the members and said, do you want to demutualize? Here's the benefits. You can have some money in your hand. And so a lot of them did. And then we kind of saw integration with other financial services companies. So now Scottish Widows sits within Lloyds Banking Group, and you've kind of got that ability to service across the market. Yeah, I think that was kind of it. It fell out of favor, this kind of drive towards maximum efficiency, free markets, corporations delivering effective and efficient benefits for everyone, was the story of the day.
We see it in every walk of life, right? Let's make farming more efficient and more intensive. All of a sudden we deplete entire ecosystems. Let's push everything to the point of efficiency. Are you familiar with Rory Sutherland? He's a marketing theorist and psychologist. No. He's amazing. You'd love his stuff. And he talks about the dangers of that. So he talks about managing through spreadsheets. They're wonderful, but they leave no space for imagination or inspiration.
Yep.
Our finance director, Ellie Adams, is killing me right now because she would say, no, an Excel spreadsheet absolutely leave it. No, it doesn't. It's not where creativity is found. It's there's a cost to being really efficient.
You need some redundancy in a system. I think that's what we need more of. I think we saw in COVID that the more efficient a system is, the more interconnected a system is, the more global a system is, the more fragile it becomes. And so when shocks happen to it, if you don't have redundancy built in, if you don't have duplication built in, if you don't have local approaches built in, then one shock on one side of the globe can reverberate through the entire system. And so if we want to build resilience, then we need to start thinking about building in redundancy.
Sad reality is, I think, and we'll segue on to climate and the environment, but I think probably to mobilize the investment we need to do anything, we're going to have to run so close to being over efficient and over. Well, we're seeing it. We're seeing commercial forestry badged as natural capital because it's understandable and efficient and replicable, and people think it's industrial, so they're more comfortable with it. I think we're probably going to need to go beyond there to then drop back into something that's a bit more wholesome. Talk to me about what you're hearing from the sector around the emergence of natural capital.
So we've got a lot of puzzled looks at the moment. So when we developed this net zero investment framework that a lot of big investors and asset managers signed up to, there were two big levers. And we've really been focused on the first lever, which is decarbonize your portfolios. Everyone's been focused on how do we green finance, right? How do we decarbonize companies? How do we divest, engage, etc.? How do we tilt our portfolios? But the other lever is how do we direct capital towards climate solutions?
Before we go off the first lever, should we divest from fossil fuel companies?
Oh, yes and no.
Okay, give me both.
Okay, so if you are a small investor who runs active portfolios, so say there's 1,600 companies in the world that you can invest in. If you're the kind of investor who only picks 20, why wouldn't you pick 20 good ones who can give you a good return and do good as well? If you're the kind of investor who holds everything because of the way that you've structured your investment mandate, we'll come on to whether you should in a minute, but if you hold everything, then your first kind of approach is to engage because you've decided as a rule that you're going to hold everything. The question then becomes, should you hold everything? So holding everything is called passive investment, and it's kind of believed that you need some people to make active decisions, but if you want it to be really cheap and easy to do, just hold everything and it will all kind of come out in the wash. But that's forgetting that actually capital is creative and it's just kind of following the herd. Now, if you have too
Isn't
many...
that the ultimate be wrong in the standard way?
Yes, be wrong in the standard way. So just follow the market. But if you have too many people following the market, it's like they've all gotten on the bus and sat at the back. You've got nobody driving it anymore. So you need the active choice. And this is crunch time for a lot of investors who signed up to net zero targets because they've said, we'll do a 3-year engagement. And if the company doesn't change, then we'll divest. So for a lot of these investors, it's been 3 years and they're up at crunch time. Now, what happens is if they want to divest from some of these companies, they've given themselves a benchmark of, say, the UK market, and they need to perform like the UK market, or according to their own benchmark, they're underperforming. Remember, it's a made-up benchmark, so keep that in mind. And if they divest from BP or Shell, these are really big constituents in the market, and it will introduce what investment people call tracking error. So you're not going to behave like the market anymore. So the question then becomes, do you accept the tracking error or do you change your benchmark? But again, that's like questions that big investors haven't had to deal with for a long time. So I think divestment is really a loaded question at the moment. And I think what we're really struggling with is how far can engagement go? Is BP or Shell really going to change innately if the political environment hasn't set them up for a successful transition? There is no incentive at the moment for the big oil companies to stop doing what they're doing when the political environment is still handing out licenses and failing to put a carbon tax and still offering them subsidies. They can still make money doing what they're doing, and their directors are legally obliged to maximize that profit, and so they will.
Do you think the conversations are better if people who care about the environment aren't there?
What do you mean?
So if the only people that are left as investors are those that maximize profit and don't care about impact because all the ones that care have divested, doesn't it just make them worse?
Yeah, completely. But then there's the bigger conundrum. So you see BP at the moment, they've had a lot of pressure. They're in a UK market with lots of engaged investors. People are divesting. Their share price is lower than the value of their assets. But what that does is make them a takeover target for Exxon. And you're like, okay, do we want Exxon to buy BP? So there's challenges in that as well. I think fundamentally we need to get to a point where that system is reflecting the true costs of their operating. So putting in place carbon taxes and things like that incentivize the company to transition rather than just disclose your emissions and meet for someone with coffee.
Over the last year, I've become clear on the view that I think the absence of a price on carbon is the cause of climate change.
Yeah, completely. And it is without a price on carbon, the demand for carbon markets isn't there. It's only when there is a penalty for emitting carbon and it's a cost to a business that a business is going to seek to offset that cost.
I spoke to an amazing architect who leads in sustainable design, works globally. He's just got a commission to design like a national gallery in Italy. And he said the carbon offsets that they're offering in the built property space are so cheap. Yeah. They're literally just green paint. He said the carbon offset for a ginormous, nationally significant building project is less than the cost of painting the bathrooms in the building. It's like I get that it's punitive elsewhere, and some industries are starting to see that the buying of credits is forcing a corporate board to go, we're not paying for this again. But he says in the built property sector, it's just not yet. It's just too cheap and easy to do it.
Yeah, until they start having to pay for the impacts, environmental or otherwise, that they're having, there is no incentive to change the behavior.
Okay, so let's talk about the other lever.
Oh, Paul.
So you're on two levers. You were on the lever of...
Yes, right. So divest, greening the financial system. Lots of people have figured out what they're doing in that space, whether it's changing their portfolios or engaging or divesting. The next lever is about how do you start to finance a sustainable world? Where does the money need to go that it's not going today? Within the framework, we call that climate solutions. And so lots of investors are now starting to say, how do I invest in climate solutions?
Yeah, every other week someone's announcing they're going to do something in natural capital. They're not sure what it is.
Yes.
Or
So we've got the ambition statements, they're out there, and now everybody's quite confused. So the discussion papers that I'm seeing are around, well, define what is a climate solution? What are the parameters of that? Where are they? Are they investable? Do they make a return? What needs to be true in order for them to make a return? And how do you aggregate them up so that they are of a size that an institutional investor is going to be interested in them? Because it's like, so in the financial world, if you think of it like electricity, an institutional investor is like one of those big pylons that you see in the middle of a field. Like, they have that much money that I guess the equivalent is you can't go and plug your hairdryer into that pylon, right? You need to transform the energy into a way that it can go to a hairdryer. So at the moment in the climate space or the natural capital space, what we've got is a lot of hairdryers and a big pylon, and we don't have some kind of transformer in the middle to allow them to plug together.
So if you went back 5 years in the environment sector, £50,000 was a massive project.
Yeah.
All these people who, and there's a fundamental flaw we're hearing at the moment that interesting, we want to get into natural capital, we just want to invest in projects. There is no way of getting a significant amount of money into project-based investment. The pot is just not big enough in this country. Could you do it in the US? Maybe, but it'd be so inefficient to administer and look at it because you'd be putting £1 million here and £1 million there. So we talked about Rob Gardner, our mutual friend at the start, and Rob very kindly describes our model as the only one for natural capital that won't lose you money because we're predicated on owning the underlying asset. So at the base, it allows you to deploy at scale relatively quickly, albeit still not fast enough for some of the institutions, because it's taken us 2 years to build a £150 million portfolio. They want to do that in 3 months.
Yeah.
So one exciting thing is that, I mean, we don't want to sell that portfolio, but somebody in the next 5 or 10 years is going to bring £250 million land portfolio to market for natural capital. And I think that's going to get auctioned off for a ransom because all the people that want to get into this space, there won't be 4 or 5 of those portfolios that ever come to market. There'll be 1 or 2 because there's a scarcity of land in the UK.
Yeah. I think there's within the system itself, like how you're doing it, I think there is this way of working together to help take projects and the work through various owners in the financial system. So you saw it with some big renewable energy or infrastructure builds. What tends to happen is institutional investors don't like doing the originating. They like an existing portfolio.
Yep.
So you have banks doing the originating and then banks moving it off their balance sheet because they don't like very long-term debt. They like kind of 3 to 8 year debt, moving it off their balance sheet into the kind of pension world, which favors long-term debt, like 10 to 50 year debt profiles. And so moving it through the financial system in that way, then releasing the capital back to the business so it can initiate more projects, kind of creates that virtuous cycle of money doing good things.
So who are you seeing that gives you the most hope or excitement about these sort of nature-based solutions?
From the financial institution side?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Anyone who's making it a reality from just ambition statements at the moment?
there are a few little niche players that are doing interesting things and not shouting about it. Then you've got some of the big players who are just buying bits of forestry land and going tick, done. Right. So
that first bit you said about we always intended to be as understated as possible when we first started buying land, and it wasn't until we bought our 4th or 5th estate that we started publicly talking about things. Because first thing you do, if you're going to come and buy a load of land, don't tell people you're coming, or the price goes up until we'd built the structures and the systems and software to be able to value everything really accurately. And then because we had enough land under management, then it became about the engaging with people locally, and us having an absence of a public presence was more of a problem than it was a help. But yeah, we always intended to do it as quietly as we could be before there wasn't a choice, and then we got a bit louder.
Well, maybe the same thing's happening. So you're seeing some of the big houses, big asset managers do some stuff, but I think the really interesting ones are the ones that, again, are thinking differently. So you've got Cushion Pensions that launched a net zero now pension, where they offset the emissions from their investment portfolio, and they started to think about new asset allocation models, bringing in natural capital. So I think that's a really interesting approach.
They did a call to the market for managers to look at that exact.
They did. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that asset owners can do is literally go out and ask the provocative question, because it gets everybody thinking about how to do things differently. And so in that respect, asset owners can be really powerful in initiating the demand from asset managers. There are also pension schemes like Phoenix, who are quite large, who are starting to think differently, who are also disclosing what they're doing and the problems that they're having, and sharing that at conferences and things like that.
That's one of our key principles as well, that we're in a unique place because we've been able to put a portfolio together of having practical examples of all these challenges. So lots of people are talking about the hypotheticals of owning and managing land. We literally have a 2,000 line list of all the activities that go into managing an estate. So everything from livestock to built property to boundary disputes to access tracks to potholes to everything. Owning these things are incredibly complex. Until you can start showing people those challenges, they don't really understand what's involved in it. And our view is we try, and that's why we produce as much as we can through the podcast or written materials, because we want to share that with everyone. We need to grow the whole sector. If we don't, we're just going to run out of time.
I really love that approach of that knowledge is something to be shared rather than kind of
people think ideas are the things that are too precious that you shouldn't share. They're easy.
It's doing it.
Exactly. It's the implementation that's incredibly difficult and hard. And we're so fortunate that we had backing from the Auction House Group that gave us the capital to make this a reality. But all the ideas and everything like that, we'll share as much as we possibly can, because we can learn tons from other people as well.
I think there's a really untapped opportunity in the existing owners of existing estates. There's this wonderful estate out in the East Nuka Fife. Shout out to anyone who's in Scotland. And they have this market that they run on a monthly basis called Bow House, and it brings local producers together. And, through conversations with them, they've got a much clearer view on what true stewardship is than the kind of shorter term focused view of stewardship that exists in financial services. They would never deplete their land in the first 5 years at the expense of the next 30 years. This kind of long-term thinking, the holding on to something for a generation and passing it down to the next generation and maintaining its value is really ingrained in that kind of estate management view of what true stewardship is. So I think there's something in working with existing landowners as well to realize both what they already know from stewarding land through time, but also bringing new things to them to say, well, this is what you can do to help.
It's a really interesting one for us. So our model is very much acquire and own for operation. And I sometimes get asked, well, what would you tell other landowners to do? And I'm like, nothing. It's their land. If they'd like to see or share anything that we're doing, you're very welcome. Come and have a look. But we don't have the history of being a sheep farmer on a certain landscape for 10 generations. One of our estates, we have 2/3 of a 17th generation family farm. We bought 2/3 of it to allow a son and family to inherit from dad and sort the family arrangements out. And that's amazing because they run the day-to-day operations of the site and are so embedded in that local community, whereas we're able to provide capital and help them develop new woodland and new natural capital side of it. But the operation of the farm is very much that traditional model. So that's the nearest we get to operating in that way, I think. You mentioned about those that are buying sort of swathes of forest or woodland and sort of tacking it onto the edge of what we're doing. Do you think that's a gateway towards a more holistic approach to this, or do you think it's a barrier to progress?
I don't think it's a barrier. I think on that kind of allowing yourself to fail, I think any step in that direction is a good step, so long as we recognize that it is just a step and not the end state. I think we need the development of some of the other ancillary areas like carbon markets, etc., to really promote wider scale adoption. But I don't think it's wrong in and of itself. And
no, I think we need a ton of solutions.
Yeah.
And people
layered on top of each other.
Yeah. So we had Richard Kelly, who heads up the Foresight Sustainable Forestry Fund, on the podcast. And some of the sort of very traditional environmentalists we work with went, oh no, you shouldn't have him on the podcast, he's a forester. And I'm like, what? Yeah. No, learn from everybody. So we recognise there's absolutely a need for more native UK grown timber here. I think the stat is something like 78% of timber is imported. and we need to use more than we are doing anyway as a building material to be more sustainable. So I want Richard and his team to do tons of forestry in the right place in the right way. We just don't happen to be foresters. Our expertise is in this field, so we'll stay in our lane. But it was awesome to learn from him and how he's approaching things as well, because we need multiple solutions, not just one.
I think that there's a huge bit in there around like, don't demonize people for having different views.
Yeah.
And there's two really interesting
The
examples.
environment sector is really guilty of that.
Yeah. And so I did some research in Australia in this small town called Collie, and they've been coal miners and the kind of area where power has been generated in Western Australia for a long time. And they came up as an example of the just transition and a place that has actually done something rather than talking about something. So I went there to do some research. And one of the first things that they did was stop the demonization. It was kind of being called the dirty coal collie town. And it's like, no, we need to respect the heritage that has been here and that coal miners have powered the state for such a long time. And, honor that legacy and then reimagine the legacy. And it's not until you honor it that you can reimagine it. And I think the same is true of really dirty industries. You see it when we first started looking at decarbonizing portfolios, people would kind of get the Excel spreadsheet and find out who the carbon emitters were. And they go, okay, so diversified miners are really high carbon emitters. Let's just eject them from the portfolio. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. Why are diversified miners massive emitters? And so as investors, we got miners together with the users of their products. So this was steel manufacturers. So they needed iron ore, the thermal coal in order to make steel. But we need steel for wind turbines. So you can't just say that one thing is bad. And so we had this discussion with them about carbon emissions. And at first, the question was, who's going to put the carbon emissions in their disclosure report and who's going to be the bad guy? And we were like, no, that's the wrong question. The question is, where are the emissions coming from? What is the manufacturing process that causes those emissions? And can you change the manufacturing process to avoid the emissions? And the engineers, because engineers love a problem, they're like, yeah, of course, we can manufacture steel without thermal coal, but we don't. We're like, well, why don't you? So because it's more expensive, because if we do that in Europe, then China will still manufacture using coal and then their steel will be cheaper and then people will just import it. It's like, well, what would you need to be true for us to really invest in and make the commercial case for electrified steel? Like we'd need a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And years later, we now have that in place. So it's not beyond the wit of man if you ask the right questions to get into what is the thing that actually needs to change. But if you're refusing to even have a conversation with people because they're the bad guys, then you're not going to get to that answer.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to keep asking more whys and ask to understand, not just waiting to respond to what's been said.
Yeah, but why? But why? But why? Over and over again.
It's so true. Let's talk about carbon markets.
Okay.
One thing on China before we go past. I saw a fact shared the other day that in the next 2 years, China will have made more progress around renewable energy and will be have made more progress towards net zero than anywhere else in the world. Yeah. Which, what I love about that is it will take away the most commonly heralded argument against our net zero. Well, what about China?
What about China?
Which is what you get straight away as opposed to, well, hold on, why don't we want to be better or progress in terms of what we're doing?
On the China bit,
Yeah.
So I met with a group of visiting Beijing officials in 2018 I do some lecturing at Cambridge University, and they were at Cambridge, and I had to do a lecture on the financial system and how you can use it to decarbonize. I had to speak, and they were all translated because I can't speak Chinese. But I thought it was brilliant that they were visiting and taking the lessons and then taking them away again. And I think the big thing that they have going for them is this commitment to 5-year plans and the longevity of that plan without the same political turmoil that we are experiencing. And you're really starting to see that come into fruition with the progress that they're making.
Yeah, and culturally, if a commitment's made, it's kept.
Yes.
Whereas actually, we just announce things and then change our mind or don't bother.
Or don't deliver it.
Yeah, but again, back to your previous point, it's a system we've created and have the power to do something about if we really want to.
Yeah. It's a system we've chosen to live in. We've designed it. We just, I think we've got too many people working in it and not enough people changing it, like the Kaizen principle that you spoke about earlier.
Yeah, I agree. Carbon credits, good or bad?
Both.
Say more.
Necessary, but not sufficient. So we need more carbon credits, we need higher quality carbon credits. We need a carbon price to go alongside and create the demand for carbon credits. But also fundamentally bad on an existential philosophical perspective, because some things shouldn't have a price. So I don't know. So nature capital, natural capital, carbon price. There are some things when you put a price on it, it becomes devalued. And if you put a price on it that is insufficient, you're devaluing it. Take love. I mean, you don't put a price on the love between you and your wife. But if you were to put a price on love, that changes what that is. And in the same way with nature, I think we're incapable of really understanding what the true value and price of nature is, because it does so much. I saw somewhere these silly quotes, 50% of GDP is dependent on nature. No, I'm sorry, like 100% of GDP, we're all dependent on nature. If we have no air to breathe, we have no economy and we're all dead. So it's 100% dependent. Other things that say Amazon, the company, is valued more than the Amazon rainforest. So actually we should make Amazon, the company, flourish. No, we're calculating it incorrectly. So I think the calculations are necessary to shift behavior, but they're not sufficient in and of themselves. Actually, it comes back to that category error, which is underneath a lot of what we do, which is right back to the start of like Christianity and religion and all of that kind of stuff, where man has been set upon this world to have dominion over nature. And that's one worldview. And the other worldview is that actually no, man is a part of nature. We are just one of many species that belongs and lives in nature. And those are two very different opposing worldviews. And this one is what has shaped our economic system. And so I think carbon markets, natural capital, they are the economic language of the system, but they're not necessarily the human language.
You mentioned the language of economics and carbon markets. One of the questions we get asked so much is, surely we can't expect people to take lower returns for the good of the environment, can we?
Yes. And it's because you're missing half the sentence when we talk about financial returns. So if we come back to that purpose of money and who are we investing on behalf of, it was actually a director when I worked at Aegon. I was really involved in the kind of theory of finance. And someone took me out of that world and said that you've got to understand that this money is being used on behalf of people. Go and be head of customer strategy and research and understand the people. And that's when I realized that most people in finance focus on the top line, right? And the top line is how much money you're making. So when people save into their pensions, they're putting money away so that at some point they can take that money out and spend it in the future. So really what they're transferring through time is not just money, but purchasing power, their ability to buy a coffee or a boat or food or electricity. And so if you're talking about purchasing power, it has both a numerator, which is your pension pot, how much it grows, how much return it makes, but it also has a denominator, which is how much do things cost in this future world that you're talking about. And most people in finance forget about the denominator aspect and have only focused on how do you maximize returns. But we're now at a point where what we invest in, what we create with this money is creating very different futures. What you're going to be able to buy and what your lifestyle will look like in a 1.5 degree world and a 4 degree world is going to be very different. And we see that now with the cost of living crisis. So if you can maximize your returns, but you end up with a shitty future, then actually your standard of living is going to be lower. So we're not asking the right question there. It's not just about maximizing returns, but what kind of future are you creating or contributing towards for people to live in the future? And I think when we take both of those aspects into account, the conversation becomes different. And I think the other side that goes along with it is, okay, should we accept lower returns? I think the upside down of that question is it morally and ethically okay for people to earn outsized financial returns at the expense of the planet and people and society? When did we decide that it was okay for people to make money no matter what? And I think that part of it needs to be addressed as well.
In the it's an amazing book called Pricing the Priceless by Paula DePerno. Have you read
I have not, but it sounds like one I should.
She said, when you look at the cost of a significant environmental event, so an oil spill, it's good for GDP.
Yeah, that's right.
It's good for growth. There's no discount for the species lost or death, but you get to claim the money spent on the cleanup operation. I think, what a perverse situation you can live in when that on the balance sheet looks like a positive.
Yeah. And that again is something that we've made up. We've decided the components that go into GDP, we could make it differently.
Yeah.
We could net it out. We could have net GDP and start to include some of the things or remove some of the things that are bad, and start thinking about different ways to measure. But again, it requires that kind of emperor is naked moment.
It's that that's my counterfactual when people talk about pricing the environment morally wrong. Try the reverse.
Yeah.
All it's done is led to destruction. The absence of a genuine price on carbon has caused climate change. The absence of a genuine consequence to sewerage in rivers has led to all our rivers and lakes being dead in the UK. The fact that no producer is genuinely responsible for their plastics has led to rivers flowing with plastics. We've done it to ourselves. It's been an active choice because we've said, money, thank you, consequence, we don't give a damn.
And we've strangely created a legal structure for corporations that if you were to write it down and put it through a psychological test would tell you that it was like a sociopath. So we've created sociopathic corporations and then decided that letting them inform the market and the market rule the world was a good idea.
And so I was thinking about it when you were just talking earlier about working in sort of the financial sector. It's not the majority of people. It's the collaborative system that is behaving. Yes, we built it and yes, we're responsible for it, but the individual people you could have a conversation with and they would see the positives and the benefits and the reason to do the right thing. But within the operating system and structure that we've asked them to behave in, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that.
Yeah.
Got to do the conventional thing.
Well, this is the button I'm supposed to push. Yeah.
Awful. How do we lead to better carbon markets? So we're bringing to market this year what we hope is the premium carbon product. So something that is based on land we own in perpetuity, that we manage for positive impact for people and for wildlife, that's independently verified, that's geolocated, that you can go visit and see and touch and interact with and swim in the rivers and walk up the hills, seeing it so it's real. We're working with some amazing partners to try and make these insurable and quality assessed. And then the key thing where we're trying to add value is we're only going to work with one partner per project. So an individual estate, or maybe even the entire portfolio, we're going to work with individual partners so that they get the whole suite of digital assets we have. So photography, videography, the podcast, the stories linked to a place to allow them to amplify that. How do you think that'll land to potential buyers in the financial sector?
Some of them are going to love it and like genuinely love it. Some of them are going to love it because it's going to play well into their board. Some of them are going to love it because it'll play well into a product and it'll be the next wheeze and they'll get on board because of that. And some of them are just going to hate it. And I think you'll have that kind of normal distribution.
It's a good job we only need 1 to 11 buyers.
Exactly, you'll be fine. I think there's definitely at least a dozen people who are going to love it and genuinely love it. I think
we're trying to do what Tesla did.
Yeah.
So pre-Tesla, electric car was a milk float. And then Prius kind of arrived a little bit. But suddenly it went from electric vehicles being a joke to, oh my God, the best car you could buy was an electric vehicle. It was a quantum leap. We didn't need that nudge forward, we need that massive change. We're trying to overshoot every way we can to make a credit authentic and credible and touchable and real so that it drags the entire market up.
I think it's a really good door or window for people who are saving into their pension. They have such an issue connecting with it, engaging with it, saving into it. I think being able to go to a place that is funded by your pension and know that that forest or that biodiversity is there because you've contributed to it helps bring something that is intangible and in the future into the present.
One of the pension funds that we spoke to had, they said, could we have a system whereby, because we've got holiday cottages on some of these estates, that a certain number of members of the scheme would get pulled out of the hat and invited to visit an estate? Absolutely. Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Because the thing about carbon is, and it's even more challenging with nature, it's a difficult thing for people to grab and really believe in. And if you're investing in a carbon product that is at the far side of the world, on land that may or not be indigenously owned, it could have unintended consequences. We've seen lots of negative press on those type of products. I just think if we can bring it closer and real to people and show the impact, we've got a chance of moving that market forward.
Yeah, and I think what it also offers is the opportunity to be in nature and reconnect with nature. I think we saw through COVID that people needed that connection with nature, but for a lot of our young people, they've lost that connection with nature. Everything has been so digital, and there's a real clamoring, I think, for young people, to be back in nature and just, I don't know, go wild in the woods and have those kind of 2 years given back to them.
You told me a horrifically interesting story about how we're losing words. Do you want to share that for me again?
Yes, I do. So it is a horrific story. So wonderful, wonderful authors have put together this book and a song, which you have to look up.
I didn't realize I was starting the Rich Stockdale book club when we started this podcast.
Totally
we just talk about books too.
So they were updating the children's dictionary, and they were removing words that were no longer in use and putting in new words. So some of the new words that they're putting in is like TikTok or computers or iPhones and things like that. And the words they're removing are words that they should not be removing. So otter and sparrow and all these words associated with nature. And so a group of poets and musicians got together to create this book called The Lost Words, and it's got wonderful drawings in it. And they also created a song called The Lost Words Blessing, which is a beautiful song. I recommend you all listen to it. And they also have this wonderful book called The Lost Spells and wonderful, wonderful graphics. And I just think it's horrifying that we're taking out of our language these really important words that connect us with nature. Because fundamentally, when we name things, it gives it real power. And I think that's a huge part of what I want to focus on for the next kind of 10 years is this imagining space of naming things that have not been yet named, of speaking things into existence that don't exist today that will help us kind of bridge into a new future.
Amazing. What's next for you on your list of what you want to do and explore?
Well, part of it is this speaking things into existence. So I was in-house in the asset owner community for a long time. I've been out now doing consultancy and research, which I'm loving, since 2022. Part of that is working with financial institutions, some big consultancies. But another kind of pillar of the work that I do is getting to ask questions that nobody else is asking yet in a really kind of self-directed way. So one of the questions was about the just transition and how do you do that in practice? And then finding out how you do it, bringing the learnings back, and then informing the Scottish Government. And lots of these questions, nobody will pay you to ask them. So that's the kind of stuff that I do off my own back. So I'm really enjoying that. I worry that perhaps if I stay out too long, I'll never be able to squeeze myself back into a corporate box. But I guess those that have worked with me before will tell you that I probably didn't fit in that box anyway. So that's not a surprise. I think I want to speak things into existence. I want to create the frameworks that don't yet exist to help the industry do things differently. The thing that we spoke about, the numerator and the denominator, I want to create that into a theory. I want to write some stuff down. And I think there is something with being of a certain age where I'm becoming slightly mellower, a little bit more reflective, and wanting to share knowledge. So yeah, continuing to do lecturing with Cambridge. And I think one of the things I miss the most working for myself is having a team of young people to inspire and help develop. So I think finding a way to give back into the community and help younger people develop and grow, who are not my own children, to do that as well. But I think it's still, I don't know, like, you know, when you have moments in your life where the next phase feels like it's a little bit behind a veil and you're not really sure what it is yet. So that's where I am. So I'm trying to sit with that degree of uncomfortableness and allow it to grow in a kind of nature inspired way. And you can't go and berate the tree for not being, you know, your leaves are not coming through fast enough. Like, you can't do that. You just have, there's an element of patience in allowing it to come into fruition.
That's lovely. If there's some crazy potential collaborators out there that would love to hear your voice and help it influence their business, how do they get in touch with you?
So go to the internet, A Future Worth Living In. You will find us there. Come and climb off the seat. I'm often found wandering in the hills. Call me. My phone number's on there. Any way you can connect with me. I'm really keen to work with and across the web of financial institutions in the UK. There's clearly a better way to do it than competition. We ought to all get in a room and figure out how to do some of this stuff in a collaborative way. 'Cause otherwise, we just won't do it fast enough.
Amazing. Kaisie, thank you so much for coming in. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys.